So we're talking here about the rise of the American corporation as part of the Enterprise and Governance course in SILS at Waseda University. And I want to set the context of the rise of American capitalism, which features so prominently in our textbook, The Company, in a broader context of discussions about what we might call, sometimes are called by academics, settler capitalisms. This notion that we have market systems, in some sense, bringing basic capitalist institutions and capitalist practices to a whole range of locations that were beyond Western Europe. So particularly there was some displacement of original inhabitants, and we see a projection then of, in some sense, nascent Western capitalism, although very diverse institutions and practices based on the colonial origins of the settlers. And this is very important to think in these terms, because if we look comparatively across economies, how they've performed over the last century or so, and particularly in recent decades, we note that on a whole range of metrics, some of these societies that perhaps have some of the most contentious foundations, particularly with this displacement and dispossessional history, a very dark history in some respects, have nonetheless go on to be some of the most cosmopolitan societies, some of the highest rates of economic growth. And when we look at rates of comparative happiness, health and well-being, what we find is that at least a subset of these settler capitalist societies are in the top ranks of all countries by relevant measures today. So we all know the basic history, I believe, of the intensive settlement of what was described as the New World. Of course, that references the Old World, continental Europe, and Britain in particular, alongside continental Europe, reaching out into the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, parts of Africa, and other parts of the world at large. So the first thing to note, of course, is that the resulting societies and economies are very heavily patterned institutionally and culturally by the legacies of the original colonial power. And one of the things that economists and historians have been interested in over the decades since the process of decolonization is how those colonial legacies have continued, not just in terms of obviously language and cultural elements, but basic institutions of capitalism, and then a whole range of issues around economic performance. As a generalization, the colonies that had an Anglo foundation that were a function of effectively British colonialism, for the most part, as a generalization, have notably outperformed other former colonies, and that raises a range of interesting questions. Of course, sometimes in contemporary Britain, people take a certain pride in that, but particularly where, in some sense, the economic systems were treated as the host societies were treated as a tabula rasa, as a blank page, where in a sense, the dispossession of the local inhabitants was so profound that entirely new economic systems were built on those new host territories. We can see that generally the British legacy seems to have led to relatively better economic outcomes. Now, of course, there are many other factors that kick in, that raise questions about some kind of assumption that it was a particular set of advantages that came from British capitalism, nascent British capitalism, different resource endowments, for example. But nonetheless, it is a fairly safe generalization to say that Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States, and to some degree even Israel, although it was only several decades under British mandate rule, that there was some patterning of economic institutions there that have served those societies reasonably well subsequently. And that's not in any way to distract or to downplay many of the very painful, destructive, racist, dispossessional elements, in a sense, the original sin of some of these founding societies. So what we see is that effectively throughout the Anglo-American offshoot world as a whole, in terms of institutional arrangements, fairly robust economies. Although there is a significant difference across each of those settler capitalisms of an Anglo orientation, and part of it is simply a difference in scale. A small place like New Zealand, slightly larger place like Australia. Australia looks much larger than New Zealand, but only if you look at the two. And then Canada, which as an economy is a little bit larger than Australia still. Then, of course, all of these are dwarfed by comparison with the scale of America. And so let's focus our discussion here, first of all, on America, because it's not just a tale of successful settler capitalism. It really is the cauldron, in a sense, out of which the development of the modern institution, the use of the corporate form, and as we've seen in previous modules, particularly limited liability as a basis for organizing business, we see that coupled with the massification of production, mass production, the building of enterprises at great organizational scale, supply chains at great organizational scale, mass mobilization of capital as well, all of which is really about gaining returns to the potential scale of economic growth that was possible in America. And partly, again, it's an endowment story. The land and natural resources and whatnot in America presented great development opportunities. Partly was the relative proximity of America to Europe across the Atlantic, in contrast to the Australian continent, which was just so much further away. And so that relative proximity meant, of course, it was a much easier migration destination for mass migrations of people out of Europe, and more literally to and fro in the days before we had aeroplanes, of course, and the telegraph and all of those things, which allowed the rapid transmission of information and people to connect. We see that going to some degree back and forth between Europe and America was more viable, and so we had a rapid pace of transition or transmission of technology, of capital, of positive feedback, which then fed back into increased migration, for example, increased flows of capital. So part of the story here in all of these successful settler capitalisms is typically a virtuous cycle of positive expectations about what these new lands presented, leading to an initial flow of pioneers who were highly entrepreneurial, and the flow of capital then to take advantage of those opportunities, attracting, of course, then lots of workers, lots of migrants. And so the inbound flow of labor into the new colonies, the new territories, then acts in this virtuous cycle, boosting further the confidence of investors because they see that these are actually growing societies. They'll have growing domestic markets. They're increasing returns to investment in things like manufacturing and transport and whatnot. And so it becomes a self-sustaining process where there's very significant reinforcing confidence in the flow of factors of production. At the same time, technological innovations in shipping, in really basic things like in the late 19th century refrigeration technology, which makes it possible, for example, to ship chilled meat, for example, means that more and more the large-scale agriculture that was possible in the Great Plains, for example, of the United States, or in parts of Australia and Canada, come to be geared towards serving European markets. And so that leads then to even more capital flows and even more flows of people. And so there is this virtuous cycle of, on the one hand, exporting some produce, taking advantage of the competitive or the comparative advantage of these new settlements, large-scale agricultural lands, then the growing population, so the growth of manufacturing and whatnot to serve then this increasingly large population within the new settlements. So in the American case, this virtuous cycle is very clear. It leads to particularly outsized relative flows of migrants and capital. And all of this adds up to the old cliche about America, that America is big. Everything is big. The drinks in McDonald's are big. The serve of the food is big. The scale of America is big. And the companies become big. And this becomes then a model for the creation of the capitalist enterprise in so many other countries. So as I say here in the slides, a virtuous historical cycle of economic growth, and this supports both public and private institution immigration from the old worlds. At the same time, one of the striking things is that there is a lot of volatility. Partly this is to do with the inherent vulnerabilities of the agricultural cycle, inclement weather and unpredictable weather and whatnot. But also there's significant boom and bust elements here. And we have both push and pull factors as well too. It's not always that labour flows to America, for example, just simply in response to higher returns to labour. Very often there are push factors as well. So the potato famine in Ireland, for example, where there was mass poverty, starvation, drove many Irish out of sheer desperation to seek opportunities abroad. We see similarly in parts of continental Europe, significant disruptions, sometimes political dynamics, sometimes very ugly phenomena. For example, with Tsarist Russia, there was waves of religious fundamentalism there, which manifested anti-Semitism, for example, and a lot of prejudice towards Jewish communities, and quite brazenly in one instance even the expulsion of Jewish residents from Moscow. So we see that many people in the greater Tsarist Empire, which was very large, which extended into parts of contemporary Poland, for example, which had very large Jewish communities, we see very large migration of people who were subject to prejudice, sometimes violent pogroms, for example, moving to America. Of course, one of the early foundational stories of white settlement in America is, of course, the flight from religious persecution. The pilgrims who leave are effectively a minority, in some sense radical, nonconformist Christians who were in conflict with the authority of the Protestant Church of England, and as a consequence sought refuge in the new world of the Americas. So what we see is these push factors very often lead large numbers of people to move to America at a rate at times which exceeds the immediate demand for labour and the immediate returns. So there are periods when there is significant poverty, and there's often pockets of quite substantial poverty, especially when people first arrive. So we see, for example, in New York, where an astonishing proportion of the migrants would arrive, that population densities in the city now are about a third of what they were. We think of the world increasingly clustering on big cities and people moving to the big cities and whatnot. But actually, population density in New York over the last century has actually declined quite substantially as people simply demand better living conditions. Huge numbers of people used to arrive, they would land in America, and then, hence the message, go west young man, for example, would then fan out from New York when they realized that there wasn't well-paid work or business opportunities immediately available, simply because of the large inflow of migrants. Another critical thing that actually leads to instability in the economy, that the several periods of bad depression, is disruption in capital flows out of Europe. So when there's significant economic downturns in Europe, that leads to a drying up of investment flowing, particularly say from places like the City of London, to the American economy. So periods of depression, 1840s, 1873, particularly bad, early 1890s, which is experienced in a very bad way as well in colonies such as Australia, so in a different place. And then, of course, the early 1930s, the Great Depression, we're familiar with. On every single one of these recessions or depressions actually hit harder the peripheral New World economies than the central Old World economies, which is a very striking thing. Sometimes you did have actually reverse flows of people, but at the same time, a natural constraint against this was, of course, the sheer difficulty of moving back home. The modern welfare state didn't exist, so people often didn't have anything to go back to in the old country, for example. So even if conditions were very tough where they had migrated to, they often felt trapped, stuck there, and had to make the best of it. And this vulnerability to shocks, sometimes external shocks, particularly extending from capital markets, and particularly out of the City of London, for example, and on the other hand, the story of openness and welcoming others, the tired and huddled masses, and the famous refrain, which is encoded into the Statue of Liberty, for example, there is gives rise to a certain what we would call ideation or ideas-based tension between origins of openness and vulnerability. So we'll see that all of these settler capitalisms tend to flip-flop between taking a certain pride in their cosmopolitanness and their openness, but also a certain defensiveness. The 2020 COVID pandemic response by each of these societies gives us certain hints on this, that countries that, despite having a history of inbound migration and openness and being prime destination, for example, for international students, they instinctively were quite quick to actually close their borders. My country, Australia, is actually one of the most extreme on this. Despite 30% of the population being foreign-born, 50% of people either being foreign-born or having one parent foreign-born. So half of all the population, at least some has one parent who is foreign-born. Yet the response of Australia was to close the border to everyone other than citizens and permanent residents, and even then to put very tight quotas on arrivals, which in effect meant that even many citizens, like myself, abroad couldn't return to their own country. So the island in the Pacific thing. The United States did a similar thing fairly early on, and it was a bone of contention between the European Union and the United States that it wasn't until about late September, early October in 2021 that the United States actually significantly opened its borders again to people arriving from Europe. So this is particularly bearable actually in the United States because of the sheer scale of the domestic economy. And we'll talk further about this when we talk about foreign investment later on in the course, with the rise of the multinational enterprise and then political responses. But America, because of its sheer scale, can afford to be quite inward-looking. And we've seen earlier on in the course that the percentage of contribution to GDP that exports makes is relatively very low in America compared to OECD countries. The case in Germany, it's something like 5 times the order. So effectively, the increasing scale of the domestic American economy is its best protection against shocks originating from abroad. New Zealand and Australia are much smaller economies, tiny by comparison. The New Zealand population is something like 1/100th of, a bit over 1/100th of the American population. So although it too went down the path of protectionism, we see that it had to be much more a price taker, much more nimble, agile in terms of dealing with external shocks. Now, much of our textbook talks about America in the context of the rise of the large corporation and the interdependence between significant societal prosperity and the rise of these enormous industrial enterprises. Mark Twain very famously spoke of the Gilded Age, writing back in 1873, but he was actually being quite ironic at the time. So his argument there was that there were myriad social problems masked by a thin veneer of gold surfacing. So the surface prosperity masked a lot of human suffering. But what is unquestionably true, and from our perspective in trying to understand the rise of the corporation as the primary vehicle of economic endeavour over the last century, we know from the text that great personal fortunes were created through industries that were associated with the expansion of the railways, for instance, and then the concomitant growth of the iron and steel industry, later on the rise of the oil industry, for example. So all of those things that nicely explicated in the textbook. So what we note in the United States is that while it was continuing to be open to migration, nonetheless, despite these ups and downs, these depressions and whatnot, real wages still rose by about 60% between 1860 to 1890. So what this means is you have mass inbound migration, but the scale of economic growth is just so substantial with the mobilization of capital and natural resources through new organizational forms of the large company, increasingly diversified company, in Alfred Chandler's terms, the capturing of scale and scope. And so real wages, that's incomes adjusted for inflation, notably rose by about 60%, and this of course feeds then further into the demand for migrants and the supply of migrants. People hear about this massive chain migration patterns where people go to America, they get settled, they get a decent job, or they start a business, for example, they write to relatives and they urge them to come and join them. So we see some rise of trade unions as a counterweight to the really powerful industrialists, and the text and some of the other video material we've got in the course speaks to this. Sometimes large companies were very brutal in terms of responding to unions. We see people like Andrew Carnegie. Sometimes was tough, but also could be very pragmatic as well. What is strikingly the case in America is that for the most part, relative to what we see in Britain and France, later in Germany, certainly in Australia, that trade unions don't grow to have the same level of economic clout in many industries as they do elsewhere. So there are real questions about why this is the case in the United States. One argument is just simply the mobility of labor. That rather for individuals, rather than joining a union and being involved in industrial disputation and whatnot, it was just simply easier to leave a company, maybe move to somewhere else in America, seek higher returns. So the mobility of labor is a very significant feature in America. And that's partly because of the decentralized, very diverse set of economic opportunities that existed in America, and the growing scale in itself meant that we see relatively low industry concentration ratios, although the iron and steel industry around Bethlehem Steel, for example, and whatnot, the examples that textbooks talk about, is we see this very deliberate building of large industrial conglomerates, cartels and whatnot, to try and overcome the disadvantage that comes from intense competition amongst firms in the same industry. But nonetheless, the increasing scale of enterprise and the breadth and depth of economic growth in America meant that rather than staying in one small town and forming a union and battling with the town employer, just simply getting on the train with your family and your possessions and moving out west or moving somewhere else where there are other opportunities, individually often made much more sense than some kind of political collective action, which was sometimes considerably risky. The other critical thing in the United States, which tends to undermine the rise of organized labor, is racial divides. The dark legacy of slavery in the United States arguably undermines to some degree the sense of solidarity amongst the working classes in America. And that's a topic we will come back to discuss further. Critically, though, we can summarize the lessons of the second half of the 19th century in the United States in terms of the history of business and economy, is that wealth is being built through the scalability of businesses. They use the mass mobilization of resources, high throughput, and they offer a value proposition of building the economic and social infrastructure of the future. And we kind of couch it in those terms because we see striking parallels of what's happened in the last 20 to 30 years in America, in a different place, largely out of Silicon Valley, San Francisco, where the new economic and social architecture, the digital architecture of the world, has been to a significant degree forged in a remarkable parallel to what we see a bit over a century earlier. Let's speak briefly to the railways and settlement. The virtuous cycle here. The railways hastened the settlement of the Midwest and later the Far West. Okay, by about 1890, the Great Plains were largely in private ownership. Native Americans had been very severely dispossessed, and many Americans, Native Americans, the first Americans, the first settlers, or sorry, the first inhabitants, had to make very difficult choices between moving into the reservation systems and going into the settler market economy, where they were typically in very weak position, often badly exploited. So a dark history in many respects, some degree obscured by the glorification of Hollywood from the 1920s on, but in more recent decades, a much more kind of honest discussion of the real costs there. We should say, though, that in terms of generalizations about white settlement or imperialism or colonialism and dispossession, that there were always critical voices. And we see that, for example, even the creating of the reservation systems through the federal government in the United States was partly an attempt to protect first Americans from the predations, the exploitation of very aggressive frontier settlement. And some of the consequences were quite counterproductive of reservation systems and whatnot. But at least there was this recognition by some, and there were some very critical writings at the time, of how referred to as Native Americans were being appallingly mistreated, were becoming the primary victims of the mass settlement of the United States, which overall was strongly boosting the economy and the strength of America, but at great cost to the first Americans. So the railways being obviously a unifier, a mechanism for transcending the space, spatial constraints is what we call in the history of Australia, the tyranny of distance, of overcoming the tyranny of distance. They, of course, are very iron and steel intense and need precision manufacturing to obviously make engines and rolling stock and whatnot. A fair degree of labour intensity too, and actually in building the rolling stock and in laying the tracks and whatnot. So we see that the railways are a significant catalyst for industrialisation. But also for a very large expansion in farming right up into the early 20th century. Simply, you could get your product to market. And this is big urban markets out east, the eastern states, but also onto ships and to sell agricultural products to Europe. Then, of course, processing technologies, things like preservation technologies, the development of modern canning, and hence the creation of renowned American delicacies such as spam and baked beans, for example. These are the kind of things that could be manufactured at scale that didn't need refrigeration and could be shipped all over the world. They also tend to underpin large-scale mobilization of military as well too, with the ability to actually create preserved food. So agricultural production soars, exports to the old world booms as the railways bring the product to port for transatlantic shipping, okay? And particularly with the application of steam to ships, this means that the journey across the Atlantic becomes much, much shorter. And this also underpins, in turn, industrialization in Europe, because a critical thing to grow the cities in Europe, to have urban populations working in either white collar or manufacturing work, is to have cheap food. And so cheap food actually makes rapid urbanization in Europe as well possible. So as I say here, falling agricultural prices, canning and later refrigeration brings cheap food to the world, but also hardship for many old and new farmers. But this was a process that had been evolving for quite a while. Back in the 1830s, we see considerable consternation, political debate, political division in Britain about whether Britain will be open to imported grains from America. Particularly corn was a very significant crop, wheat as well, but corn particularly traveled well. And this was a major political divide there. Now, Britain went down the path actually of free markets, of openness to cheap imported grain from Americas, partly because there were some pretty well-connected people involved in the trade and the financing of agriculture and whatnot. And also then the displaced labour, as domestic agriculture became less competitive, were then to move into manufacturing production. Excuse me. I would like to edit that out, but I fear I won't. So if you're seeing it, bear with me. Several things to note, of course, about America is it doesn't just start off being America as we know it now. That were obviously state-based and in significant expansion. And you've got the sets of slides here, and you can look through this yourself. So partly it's about the territorial unity of America, the incredible tragedy of the American Civil War, fought over the issue of slavery. One of the consequences of the American Civil War is actually further hastening the growth of mass manufacturing, the creation of armaments industries at scale, mobilization of people, for example. So the early transport in America mirrored what was the case in Britain, the use of canals, of waterways, okay? And this would continue to be very important. The renowned images of Mississippi, for example, and the river. Of course, if you go to Disney, one of the popular rides there is on a fake paddle steamer, and so much of our imagery of America in the past through Hollywood is associated with obviously both the railways, but also the paddle steamers. And Andrew Carnegie, for example, who migrates from Scotland with his parents. In response to effectively his father, who was a weaver, losing his livelihood because he was a very traditional weaver. He was effectively displaced by cheaper manufacturers, so the Manchester wares and whatnot. And one of Andrew Carnegie's father's first job actually was as having a relatively lowly job on a paddle steamer. So the canals are interesting because until the invention of things like dynamite, for example, the ability to, in a very controlled fashion, get big lumps of the landscape out of the way and flattening Earth, and then later on in putting steam onto wheels, and particularly creating steamrollers in order to flatten the ground to lay railways, and of course to manufacture the rails and the rolling stock itself at scale. Still the best way to move things was via water, using the old technology of boats, and then of course putting steam on them. The great advantage of steamships, by the way, is that they could be very shallow berthed. They were very wide vessels, so even when the water depth in rivers was relatively low, you could run the paddles, and so it became quite navigable. And particularly, you could just simply power up upstream, which was quite significant. So this actually led to the creation of canals, which was connecting up with a system of existing natural waterways. And you can see these maps here, and you can look more closely at the slides. Now, to get a sense of just how rapid the rollout in railways is, let's have a look at some of these numbers. So in 1840, there's about 3,000 miles of track. By 1860, there's 30,000 miles of track. It's really quite an astonishing thing given the labour intensiveness of building railways in those days. Notably, no standardised gauge. A gauge is how wide the rails are. Okay, run on rails, but different rails means that connecting up your railway system is, well, pretty much impossible because the trains can't run on other railway tracks. Unless you think this is a quaint 19th century thing. This plagued Australia until the 1990s. My own state of Queensland, I was living in Brisbane, which is only about 120 kilometres or something from the border from New South Wales. The railway gauge in New South Wales was different from that in Queensland. So you could not run a train up and down the east coast of Australia. So to take a train from Brisbane to Sydney, as I did when I was a university student, they had one extra railway track, which was actually the New South Wales gauge. These were the train was to go to Sydney. So the distance of 120, 130 kilometres or whatever from the New South Wales border up to Brisbane, that was a great innovation that had been built. Previously, you actually had to change trains at the border, which was absolutely ludicrous proposition. And so it was a great national project to actually have a uniform gauge for the railway. And even amongst Australians, they felt that the nation was a laughing stock because of this. But this has historically been a problem. There's also a multitude of operators, and our text touches on this, and video material you can look at, the likes of Vanderbilt. Cornelius Vanderbilt quite ruthlessly drove various railway operators to cooperate with mergers, acquisition processes and whatnot. Now, government has played a role in this too. 1862 Congress recognised the attraction of joining up the Pacific coast and the Atlantic coast with a transcontinental railway. So they offered two companies, Union Pacific and Central Pacific, the rights to lay the track. They provided some government loans, and very significantly, land's involved because under the English tradition, everything is crown land, or crown land belonged to the crown. Of course, it's not crown with the American Republic, but public lands, and effectively allowed those lands to be sold to raise funds in order to fund the railways. By the way, this is an ongoing discussion even today when you build new infrastructure, because land that, for example, is 30 kilometres from the city, very difficult to access, doesn't have much value. You put a new train that runs there, and so you're creating a lot of value through the convenience all along that railway track. And this absolutely patterns Tokyo as we know it. If you think about Keio and Odakyu and whatnot, the business model to build railways and to place businesses and housing developments and a whole range of other businesses as associated businesses along the railway was first experimented with simultaneously in the United States and in Britain. And then the business model was pretty much refined for urban development in Britain, and then early pioneers, entrepreneurial pioneers in Japan learnt that lesson, and that's why we see the whole spatial structure of Tokyo having been shaped by these railways that were integrated businesses, and so many of the names we still know today. So Odakyu, Tokyu, for example. Tokyu being a classic example because they still have a very substantial property development business, for example, that grew up in tandem with the creation of the railway business that they ran. So this is something that America and later in Britain really demonstrated, that by putting critical infrastructure in, you create the foundations for Obviously, greater convenience for settlement, for greater economic activity, for integration. So you create value by doing that. So then complex issues of who captures that value. And that means it's inherently political as well. So states can play a very important role in doing this. The advantages we see, effectively, if you had been trying to cross to the west coast from the east coast by stagecoach, and it was actually a very sophisticated system actually, with stagecoaches, literally with staging points all the way along, it still would take you 6 weeks. So it came down to only 5 to 6 days by train, still a heck of a long time compared to flying across in 5.5, 6 hours. But still really did open up the West for settlement. And of course, so much of Hollywood has fictionalized but played with the notion of the Wild West, when, of course, a whole bunch of scoundrels could flee their past from the east. They could head out west, reinvent themselves, of course, turn themselves into ostensibly into cowboys. But the funny thing is, we talk about cowboys, but the cows hardly ever figure right. It's just bad guys shooting each other in small towns. Anyway, 1883, we see Chicago and Seattle being linked up. So very significant developments here. And then, of course, the lake shipping interface made Chicago a critical hub. And I say here just made Chicago. Of course, Chicago then goes through a tragic Great Fire and kind of has to be rebuilt. Okay, but we can see here the pattern of the railways, how they have evolved. And in not much time. Okay, so 1870, we see the thin black line reaching across to the west coast. We see much more complicated integrative developments of the United States there, with major railway lines. The ones in red, very notably, are the ones that were developed between 1870 and 1890. So the railways, in a very significant degree, make for the unified America that we now know so well. Okay. Of course, many of you will immediately be thinking, wow, okay, that's interesting, but yeah, I might do one long train trip just to have a look at the view, but for the most part, I'm going to get on an aeroplane. So I've deliberately put the details on aeroplane and efficiencies that arise here. Okay, so just to give a sense of how a similar story of falling costs associated with capturing larger, technically efficient scale through technological innovation. So aeroplanes here, some of the early planes, their range was quite limited, and the number of passengers they could carry were quite small. So, of course, some of the planes were developed around the military, the early ones, like flying boats, for example. Flying boats lasted for quite a while. My mum recalls going down to the bay in Brisbane in Australia and watching flying boats come in down there in Wynnum, Manly, and that people who would come from overseas would, sometimes the last leg of their flight would be from further north in Australia. They would come down on a flying boat. So the really big transformation is with commercial aviation after World War II, and the Lockheed Constellation is quite significant because of the range, and most significantly, it can fly so much higher. If you look at the altitude ceiling, when you get up to 35,000 feet, it's quite stable. Below that, it's a very rough ride. And if you watch the film The Aviator, which focuses on Howard Hughes, you can see an explicit depiction of him being showing the model of the constellation and saying, this is what we need, this is the way that we will get people to fly on scale, because below that it's as rough as hell up there. And the real transformation subsequently in terms of bringing costs down with several Boeing innovation. The 707, okay, which has less of a range, but it doesn't really matter. It's long enough range to get across America, and it can carry 181 passengers. And then that's 1958, the really transformative one is the Boeing 747, okay, and so many of my early international trips were made on these. They fly so much higher still. They're up at 45,000 feet max. Huge range, 6,000, I'm not sure if this is kilometres or miles. I'm wary about that. I think it's 6,000 miles actually. And the sheer size of it, the number of passengers they can carry, is significant. Somewhere between 374, 524, depending on the configuration. Let's look at the time of crossing the Atlantic and the increasing integration we see of the American and parts of the European economies, particularly, say, from a finance perspective. So by ship, by 1910, it was only taking 6 days to get across the Atlantic. This is the power of steamships. So people would often go backwards and forwards. That was quite common. And if you were wealthier, traveling on a ship was actually quite pleasant. Okay, occasionally it could be very rough, but these were in the old luxury liners, of course. Were where wealthy people would have a time to relax and mingle with other wealthy people they didn't know because they happened to be on the journey together. Being in steerage, lower decks, where the poorer people were, was much more unpleasant. So we see by airship, you could do it in 81 hours, 1925, 1940. Seaplanes was down to about 14 hours. 1950, it was down to about 11 hours to get across the Atlantic. But also take a look at that number of ship, 3.5 days. So between 1910 and 1950, we see very significant incremental innovations in shipping, in the speeds with which ships can move. Of course, World War I and World War II gave enormous impetus to developing ship technology. So we shouldn't forget that although we have new technologies appear which ultimately come to predominate in a certain field, often you get a lot of continuing incremental innovation. A classic one now, of course, is we're very focused on electric vehicles, EV. But petrol-based engines, gasoline-based engines, have been significantly improved over the last couple of decades, where they're actually very low polluting, relatively quiet, very efficient engines these days. So while the new technologies draw our attention, the engineers have been working away very significantly for incremental innovations. We look, for example, at particle emissions that are a real problem with gasoline engines historically. That the unpleasant emissions, which can cause health problems, now are down to about 1/250th of what they were in the mid-1970s, for example, when first emission standards were written actually in California. Tokyo's air even in the mid-1970s was notoriously bad, and a combination of industrial pollution and strict standards on automobile emissions drove engineers, and California was an early pioneer in this too, drove a lot of incremental innovation. So we see it as well in the case of ships, just simply ships being better designed, more powerful, more efficient engines, and being able to move through the water quicker. Okay, so it's not that the fastest technology always dominates. I have put online there, you have a video about the tragedy of the last Concorde flight for Air France, which it crashed and led ultimately to Concorde being withdrawn. They continued to fly for a while with British Airways, but Concorde, the supersonic plane, you could get from London or Paris to New York in 3.5 hours. And actually, I have the wife of a friend who was a very high-paid specialist English-Japanese interpreter for people working in finance. In the past, she was sometimes given rides on the Concorde when Japanese companies really wanted her to be involved in negotiations in New York, and they would fly her from London on the Concorde, and she would go there and she would do the work, and then she would fly back again in the same day. So just a sense of the imagery of the planes there. Okay, Lockheed was a very significant development there. It was a military plane, which then became the Constellation and was quite transformative. So the firm in the USA our textbook gives us a lot of material on this. As we know, Great Britain was the historical home of the corporate form of business organisation, particularly as it was brought to the United States as a legal construct. The English common laws of contract and of tort, so tort just simply means wrong, okay, not like the German, like a cake, okay, no, so it's tort, the law, it's a law of wrongs, okay. These provide a rigorous body of law that provides a sound foundation for the development of modern business. Also the social context that was supportive of entrepreneurship. So as we've talked about, the corporation historically needed royal assent and then parliamentary approval, but one of the innovations was to effectively just devolve this to some regulatory body, government office, which, as long as the purposes of the company roughly fitted the corporation law, were in the parameters of the law, it was just simply, we say, rubber stamped. The expression rubber stamp came about, by the way, because once upon a time, all stamps or all seals had to be individually carved, but then some clever person figured out that you actually could just simply mold them en masse out of rubber and then glue them on, and boom, 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 and away you could stamp. Okay, so administrative processes were dramatically sped up when things didn't have to be individually written. Don't underestimate the power of copy paste, quite literally, and various parallel innovations to leading to greater efficiency in capitalism. Okay, I'm sure if you copy paste from one essay to another, it feels incredibly efficient, and it is, but it's not a very formative educational experience, and that's why we get tough on you guys for that. But the simple truth is the off-the-shelf kind of solution, the copy-paste, standardization, mass production of things, is the source of so much of our prosperity. So just in terms of the company vehicle again, the approval process for incorporation devolved to a public agency, as I said, okay? And so then these US states lead the adoption of limited liability, as we've discussed previously. A significant factor being competition between US states to create a pro-business environment to attract investment from other destinations. So one of our themes when we get into the more comparative dimensions of the class will be to emphasize actually that in many respects the US is a little bit of an outlier. The US is distinctive. We can talk meaningfully about US uniqueness on a range of aspects, but particularly there's relatively little class-based politics. Now, there's an element, of course, and Democratic and Republican politics looks like it's purely kind of class-based, but it's much more complicated than that. The phenomenon of the Southern Democrats and shifting from Republican support and a whole range of things. There's so many things we could talk about. We won't. But there are several things that drive US uniqueness. One I've already touched on, of course, the issues of race. All of this kind of comes down to with little class-based political action being, on the one hand, the perception that there is lots of scope for social mobility through individual action, that you don't have to get organized politically, forming a trade union, for example, or a political party to transform society through the state, that even if you could, that the better payoff is actually to just promote your own interests, get well educated, for example, work hard, and be amenable to relocating if you have to reskilling, to seek opportunity, to be entrepreneurial, to look for business opportunities. Okay. So because of these perceived advantages, we talk about the American dream, this idea that, anything is possible in America. Well, it's not, but relatively, regardless of background, despite issues of race, systematic race and prejudice and whatnot that still prevails, that notion that there are opportunities there for the taking is a very significant one. And this leads to certain things not happening in America that do happen in other places. but which had been advocated in America too. And particularly in the late 19th century, profound economic inequalities, massive wealth associated with these great new industrial conglomerates, and significant poverty as well, particularly in the context of the Depression of the early 1890s. But the response has become a little bit different. Rather than creating very elaborate welfare states and socialist political parties and whatnot, that we see more government interventions to break up industrial conglomerates. And one of the things we see here is that effectively the response to inequality, and particularly huge, powerful enterprises, is a market-based response. The argument that they've grown so large that market-based disciplines no longer work, and so therefore legally using the power of the state to actually break up companies, effectively to restore a degree of competition in the market, reflects a commitment to this notion that the disciplines of the market help to share the benefits of prosperity with a larger set of stakeholders. And as a consequence, therefore, the role of the state is really about market enhancement, market facilitation, rather than replacing the market. So it's not socialism. It's something rather different that wants to, in some sense, level the playing field within a capitalist system to protect smaller entrepreneurs and market competition from oligopoly. And I immediately draw a parallel here. There are a lot of debates, there has been for decades, over the South Korean business model and South Korean business experience. And what we see strikingly in South Korea is very large conglomerates, chaebol, and then you have many more smaller enterprises. But the large conglomerates are relatively very powerful. And this leads to a whole range of effects. That the incomes, the salaries, the various associated benefits, whether it's medical plans and insurance, all these things, are so much better for employees in many of these big conglomerates. And generally, the small firm sector is relatively weak. Japan actually has much greater variety. The largest companies, although there are some huge conglomerates historically, that they don't have the same degree of domination either in any particular market segment, nor do they so thoroughly dominate medium and small size enterprises. I would say, though, you still have to be a little bit wary of ending up as Stauke in some contexts, of working for others, but that's maybe arguably as much cultural as anything else, that some of the companies at the top, they tend to look after themselves pretty well and be protect their own interests by being pretty tough on the contractors. But it's as much about how you position yourself strategically. You don't want to end up being in that kind of Stauke kind of position. I think in Japan there is the plenty of scope to with enough savvy to not find yourself in that position. In the Korean case, it's often much more difficult. And the American case is very strong sense that very large companies need to be constrained by the state, but through a legal mechanism, not a political mechanism per se, but a legal mechanism with an independent judiciary that imposes very tough, what we call antitrust laws. So competition policy becomes very significant. One of the interesting things is, without a very strong socialist parties, for example, what it means is that businesses, as long as they don't abuse their market position, not facing the same kind of political challenges that they do in European countries, and we'll talk further about this, okay? So effectively, the separation of ownership and control, lots of fragmented shareholders, management who are employees as well of the company, running the enterprise. That's actually more sustainable. And at the end of the course, we'll talk further about the political economy of corporate governance. But just simply the point here is that in some societies where you have very strong unions and very strong social democratic and labour parties, for example, that end up running the state and creating labour law and whatnot to protect trade unions, the trade unions can become quite powerful in relation to a company. And employed managers, if they're not disciplined by strong shareholders, are likely to make many concessions to the trade unions. So, of course, there's also a market response to that, and you would expect stronger shareholders to emerge to discipline the managers so that they take a tough stance in turn on organised labour. A little bit complex, and I'll develop this further in our second last week in the course. We do see several sectors, though, in the United States where unions are very strong. Autos and transport, for example. And one reason why Japanese car manufacturers, when they went to America, went to places like Kentucky, was they wanted to be out of the reach of the United Auto Workers Union, which was particularly strong, organized in places like Detroit. Okay, and we can debate whether that's good or bad, but there was this very strong sense that because of the very nature of mass production, time sensitive with production lines, that strikes, for example, can hold up production and significantly disadvantage a company. So as a generalization, you'll find strong unions in industries where they're vulnerable to hold up. Shipping, getting things on and off ships, for example. So typical maritime workers, dock workers, baggage handlers. You don't need to be particularly skilled to be a baggage handler, but baggage handlers' disputes very often stop flights. This has always been the case in France, for example, where you've got very expensive capital equipment, people waiting, time sensitive, that actually significantly increases the leverage of even those who don't bring a particularly high level of skills to the job. But if they don't do the work, then everything is held up. In the creative industries, this is very famously referred to from Richard Caves as the Motley Crue effect, or the O-rings kind of model, that everything multiplied by zero becomes zero, that it only takes one part of a complex production process for everything to be held up, to be ruined, for example. That also is, by the way, why people who provide what we call the humdrum inputs into making movies, for example, the people who are, setting up the portaloos and doing the construction on site and all those kind of things, and a movie set generally are actually very well paid, because they have the capacity as well to frustrate something. If you've got A-list stars standing around and huge amounts of money at stake, then yes, you're going to pay the people who make lunch quite well to make sure that they actually turn up and do the job properly. Okay. One of the issues then is if management are giving in to powerful unions, well, how are the costs borne? Well, one of the ways that management would often buy industrial harmony is to make future promises. So they're not in the here and now, because of course management costs. Because management, of course, doesn't want to be seen to be running the company at a debt, at a loss. So they much prefer to make promises to get people back to work and the production line running and profits accruing by making promises that shift the costs to future shareholders. And typical private pension schemes, for example, is one way of doing this. So pension benefits that come due to the company in 10 or 20 years' time, well after the managers have retired. So this is a critical issue in corporate governance in the United States. Fragmented principles. In the Anglo-American tradition, minority shareholders are given relatively strong legal protection, and they've been strengthened over time, and as a consequence there are more minority shareholders. And so effectively what we see is that the law around the publicly listed, the publicly trading enterprise, the public corporation, has evolved to give minority shareholders more protection, which also makes it more attractive then for people to invest into publicly listed companies. And this has been this virtuous cycle of capital being able to be raised through a public float, for example, and businesses have been able to grow more rapidly. And this model overwhelmingly evolved in the United States with very quick kind of catch up in the UK, and then has been gradually a model for other societies. One of the implications, though, is that there's an element of kind of ownership without power, that you've got lots of fragmented shareholders, and if we go back to our logic of exit, voice, and loyalty, that if you only have a small proportion of the shares, you're not going to be decisive in terms of exercising voice. So it's not so rational to even spend time on monitoring the firm. You're kind of a price taker, so you're more likely just simply to exit. So this raises this question of who actually supervises the management in the first place. So generally, in terms of push for better corporate governance in the Anglo-American world, but then beyond, this recognition that minority shareholder protections are quite important. And this manifests in a whole range of ways. It's one of the basic things is reporting requirements, for example, that management of company is required to release information to the market in a timely way to make sure that all shareholders benefit equally from that information. That they don't just tell critical news to the larger shareholders and the minor shareholders find out later on after larger shareholders, for example, have been able to sell down their shares, okay, and move the market against the minor shareholders. Another significant development is in Anglo-American countries in general, there have been various initiatives to encourage people to develop their own private pensions, their retirement incomes, okay? So kind of Nenkin, but to do it at an individual level. My retirement fund that I had in Australia when I worked in Australian University, first of all, I had a choice of the structure of the investment of it, and I chose 100% equities, 100% shares, and I've just left it that time like that the whole time. I only worked for 7 years. The employer contributed some, I contributed some, and I've just left it the whole time on aggressive growth settings based in equities, and it's compounded in a very, very nice way. Okay, and generally this is the case in Australia. In fact, it's compulsory. In the US, it's not it's not compulsory per se, but it's very tax beneficial through, and you hear all the time about people talking about a super 401k. Now that's actually provision in the law for effectively creating your own retirement investment fund, which is a very tax effective vehicle. And so effectively what we see is that huge numbers of people have this. You know, in my country, in Australia, everyone has exposure indirectly to the share market through what we call superannuation, our retirement fund. So huge flows of money, typically required in many places, or in the American case, for tax reasons, people opt into this. So part of their income is actually put into an investment fund, for example. Okay, this strengthens the power of institutional investors as a whole, and they provide an element of corporate governance. But it also makes people kind of stakeholders in a healthy share market. And we'll see continental Europe, this is much less the case. In Japan, many pension funds, well, they're almost overwhelmingly organized on what we call a defined benefit basis. But based on a number of years you've paid in, service, there's a formula, that's how much you get. And whether there's enough money in the fund to pay all that it's promised or not is an open question. It depends on the fund being well run. When I first joined Waseda, it was estimated that there was a 70% shortfall in funds to cover Waseda's promised retirement payments to employees, which was rather disconcerting. I would hope that the returns in equity markets over the last few years have significantly fixed that. Although generally in Japan they're overinvested in Japanese bonds and whatnot, and underinvested in shares because of almost pathological fear of volatility. But the volatility takes care of itself if you hold the assets long enough. Okay. So what's really striking in the American case is a market for corporate control. And we'll use this term repeatedly, a market for corporate control. What this means is that companies can be up for sale. You can launch takeover bids. Shares are traded on the share market, okay? So you can launch a takeover bid, a TOB. We see this in the Japanese case as well. But the confidence to try and take over a publicly listed company, if you're a big investor or a rival firm or whatever, or just from a different industry and you see an opportunity to buy another firm and create synergies putting them together, that really depends on transparent accounting, full public disclosure of the state of the company. their balance sheets. Okay, it allows outsiders to value the firm and consider prospects for enhancing firm value through new strategies, management, and restructuring. So it brings a lot of transparency, and this is a great advantage of having many of your businesses publicly listed. Okay. At the same time, institutional arrangements enforce fairness norms in the market, timely disclosure requirements, and many other things. The best indicator of whether there is a market for corporate control is whether you ever see hostile takeovers, although there's a big debate about this, because arguably that when it works so well, you don't have to have hostile takeovers. That in fact, if you just see lots of merger and acquisition activity between publicly listed companies, this speaks to a very lively market for corporate control. Now, there is regulation of takeovers in some cases, Anglo-American countries too, although they generally believe in a free market for corporate control. There are some regulatory controls. There's very strong emphasis on maintaining competition. Antitrust competition law is a critical thing. So we have quite sophisticated tests of market dominance. One way of testing market dominance is a simple thing of if my product that I sell, if I change my price, is it going to have any impact on what the target companies does, for example, in terms of its pricing? So are we in the same market or not? But there are many complicated things, that the suppliers, for example, to an industry as a whole, if they're bought by one of the firms, there's the great danger that strategically they would deny critical supplies to their competitors to get corporate advantage. So a lot of the regulation of takeovers in the American context and the broader Anglo context, and my country, Australia as well too, is really focused on maintaining fair competition. Sometimes we see sectoral specific regulation. We talk about structure and conduct regulation, for example, financial services, aviation, communications, energy, media, defense. All of these things have particular sensitivities. So we tend to see some restrictions on foreign takeovers in sensitive sectors. Now, the final really distinctive element here in America is, and sorry, my slides don't want to advance properly. So please, let me try adjusting this. Okay, there we go. Oops, that was off. I hope some of the others haven't been. Haven't had an eye quite enough on that. The final really distinctive thing in America we've touched on when we looked at the difference in outcomes across systems at the beginning. And this is very large incentive compensation, very distinctive feature of American corporate governance. And when we talked about this with agency, this is about trying to get the managers of companies to think and act like shareholders, or to think, feel, and act like shareholders, okay? Is the full quote here. Okay, so large share options and performance bonuses designed to attenuate what we call the managerial agency problem, okay? That they act in the interests of the shareholders who, through the board of directors, are appointing these managers. There's a much greater need for this when the ownership and control are separated, when you don't have a powerful block shareholder, like a dominant shareholder. If you've got one shareholder who has, say, 50-60% of the shares and can determine exactly who is on the board, obviously will have very direct power over who is running the company, then those issues are not of concern. Under those circumstances, though, how the minority shareholders are looked after becomes a concern. So if you have very fragmented shareholdings, then you have a greater need to make the managers think, feel, act like they are shareholders. And this is why we tend to see these huge executive compensation packages that are here. And what's really striking in the American case is it hasn't been very politically contentious. We see in other places, such as, for example, in Germany, when some executive compensation, some share price type packages, for example, for listed companies, and there aren't so many in Germany, and we'll see that, when they were introduced and they were relatively small, there was actually quite a substantial political backlash. So that hints at a very different culture and set of organizational practices in the continental context. And the US, statistically, we saw this right at the beginning of the semester in our just our second class there, that the average executive pay and overall benefits with the share options and everything, their bonuses and everything, so what we call their executive package or the compensation, can be in the order of something like 250 times the average employee's salary. So that is where the United States is really an outlier. It very much is distinctive. But when we look at the scale of the US share market and the size of many of these companies and how relatively small the stake each of the shareholders is as part of the total body of shareholders, so how many shares they have relative to others, that helps us to understand why. And we can debate the good and the bad of that, but at the end of the day, the critical point here is that American companies grew to an historically unprecedented scale because of the scaling up of American society itself. And eventually many of these companies also start to operate on an international level. One won't necessarily say global, and a few of them become global or transnational enterprises, but they become significant international enterprises as well. And it's beyond the capacity of any individual to fund. And of course, the great wealth, the most substantial wealth held by individuals in the late 19th century was precisely because of this scaling up process. So their wealth grew with the scale of the company. So now the world's wealthiest person, Elon Musk, who, as we talked about in class, doesn't actually have any cash day to day because he draws no salary. And he kind of lives off money that he borrows from a bank secured against shares, as the world investment communities. I think many of the old hand investors are very wary about this, but many of the more enthusiastic investors believe that Tesla's got great growth prospects. They have massively increased the value of the enterprise there that he has shares in. So of course, on paper, at least he has come to be worth an enormous amount. So people who independently had a whole lot of wealth, nonetheless still didn't have the wealth to be able to fund the sheer scale of many of these enterprises. So it took a very diverse base of investors and shareholders. And so the issues of control, accountability, and incentive design came to the fore in the American context. So we'll leave it there in discussing America. I will speak to you next about the British case. That'll be a little bit of kind of going back in time and then coming forward again in time. Of course, the textbook very much dealt more in tandem, the British and the American experience, and then separately discusses the German and Japanese cases, which we will also explore soon enough. So thank you for your attention.